I hear that there were some very buzzy tables. I hope you managed to find a good conversation and meet some new people. We are heading now into the afternoon session. I'm getting a little note to remind everyone when we go into the next networking bit that if you have your camera on, it is much easier for people to establish whether or not it's a conversational table or just to sit quietly and read resources table. So cameras on when we go into the next networking session. Right, I'm going to take us into the panels. We have two panel sessions. The first one that we'll go into right now is called Perspectives, How Nature Can Transform Urban Places for People, and will be a discussion around how urban green spaces benefit people and place. I will hand over to Hilary McGrady, who's going to be chairing. Hilary is Director General of the National Trust and will introduce you to the panel members. Over to you, Hilary.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. This is a huge event. Really exciting that so many people have wanted to engage in this conversation about why nature matters in an urban context. And I'm really, really thrilled that we've got such a brilliant panel here today. People from different sectors with different perspectives, and I'm really encouraging them to bring into this conversation their specific experience from the sectors from which they come. We're going to cover, I hope, a range of subjects, and I will be trying to take some questions from the floor at the end, but I'm going to first go around my panel and I'm going to ask them a very simple question. Why does urban green space matter? And how does your work in urban green space transform places for the benefit of people? So in your introduction, you might want to think how to answer that question too. And I'm going to start with David first. David Luckin, Head of Community Funding and Partnerships for the Co-op. David.
Thanks, Hilary, and hi everyone. Great to be here. So yeah, as Hilary said, I lead our community investment program and partnerships at Co-op. This includes a local community funding program that supports more than 2,500 local charities and community groups every year. And we're also very proud to be part of the Nature Neighbourhoods program alongside National Trust, RSPB and WWF, that is seeking to explore how community sector organisations can drive positive environmental action at a local level. In terms of why urban green space matters for us, Co-op is a member-owned organisation. We've got 6 million member owners in communities across the UK, similar numbers to the National Trust. These members tend to be clustered around our 2,400 or so food stores, 800 funeral homes. And our vision as an organisation is cooperating to build more value for our member owners every day. So urban green space is effectively part of for us, it's part of a broader social value agenda. We aim to create economic value for members through products and services as a business, ownership value through people being able to, through members being able to have a say in the business and influence what we do. And then finally, social value for members' local communities on issues that members care about. And we know that Co-op members care about urban green space. So we talk to Co-op members regularly about what's on their minds. And we know that many of them in the current context feel that there are real challenges to being able to access opportunities and resources that they and their families need to thrive. And in a recent survey running up to our AGM last month, environment and protecting nature, that was the third sort of most important set of concerns after rising cost of living and access to health services. So, you know, really up there. And that was for more than 39,000 members taking part in that survey. So, you know, not 6 million, but a really solid evidence base. And as well as responding to member voice, part of why we're keen to support shared green spaces in communities is just because of the huge range of benefits that we know they can bring. And I think there's, again, something about context here. There's real pressures on communal spaces of all sorts, whether they're indoor or outdoor, and shared green spaces, as we all know, can create benefits in terms of well-being, from being in nature and improvements to the local environment. But I think a key part of the well-being benefits are about connection with others in spaces where there are often lower or very few barriers to entry. So I can just to check in terms of the format, Hilary.
Yeah, you're going to
go on and illustrate for a couple of minutes.
No, I'm going to keep going around the panel, but you trust me, you're going to get lots more opportunity to expand on that. Fantastic. Sure. Thank you. And that evidence base is so key. Actually, you've done some research, but it's very consistent that access to nature is hugely important. Lisa, I'm going to come to you next.
Great, thanks for that, Hilary. Yeah, thank you. Good to be here today. So we know that 30 million adults in England are taking part in physical activity and sport every week, but that is only 60-odd%. So 25% of the population are inactive and do less than 30 minutes of physical activity. We also know that where you live affects your relationship with sport and physical activity, and there are higher rates of inactivity across the country linked to different demographics. So access to places and spaces for recreation and movement is absolutely essential to support a healthy lifestyle. And we know for those inactive, walking, cycling and fitness are key activities, especially in outdoor green and blue settings. So at Sport England, through our strategy Uniting the Movement, we're working hard to tackle the stubborn inequalities that exist in accessing physical activity. And 28% of the people in the most deprived areas live in the 10% of areas with the least green space. So our active environment mission addresses barriers to spaces to tackle unequal access to green and blue settings, not just for physical, but social, to foster greater opportunities for activity for all. We also apply a place priority lens across our work to offer support to those who need it most, investing over £250 million into the places of greatest need to create that systemic change and address those stubborn inactivity levels. Green and blue spaces are really important settings, particularly for walking and cycling, which are some of the favoured activities for those who are starting their journey to activity. Through our statutory planning role, we also protect playing fields for formal sport, but as open spaces, they provide real wide benefits for health and well-being and can also provide opportunities for biodiversity. So in addressing access and connectivity to green and blue spaces for the community, we apply active design principles, which has a foundational principle of activity for all. And we've got some examples that we can share later, such as the Kidling Zoo trials, for want of a better. We also hold a number of partnerships, including the National Trust, the Canal and River Trust and Forestry England, and work on projects with the Youth Hostel Association, Sustrans, Centre for Sustainable Health and local authorities to pilot innovations which can affect sustainable systemic change. And I'll pause there.
Fantastic. Thank you. Tom, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, hello everyone. Tom Stratton here, Chief of Staff at the RSA. Just a potted overview of who we are and what we're doing before I sort of get into the specifics. So we're a 270-year-old social impact organisation, and our common threads throughout that history has sort of been society's biggest challenges and having our fellows at the forefront of helping solve them. And our current mission is about fulfilling potential, and that can be boiled down in terms of a strategy to three things. It's who you know, what you know, and opportunities where you live. And we've built programs around that, and we're trying to take a really multidisciplinary approach to setting up programs to try and solve some of those issues and nurture some of those things. So in terms of green spaces and nature, how does that show up? Well, doing this work, it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that for too long and too often we have undervalued nature's role in green spaces in nurturing healthy communities and thriving economies. And the weight of evidence suggests that this is something that we need to rectify very quickly. Perhaps the place where that shows up most acutely is for young children, for whom access to nature and playing in nature is a sort of lifetime endowment. And we have evidence showing that it nurtures their creativity and increases their resilience to stress. And so we, in partnership with others, including the National Trust, are responding to that through our Playful Green Planet initiative, which is about reclaiming unloved urban green spaces and making them, transforming them into outdoor playrooms, and sort of putting in place a curriculum of nature-based play. And that is going to be something that's at the moment 2 pilot sites, 2 more coming, and many more to be announced in the coming months. But that is something that we need to be a sort of a movement, a bottom-up movement, and we can talk more about how people can get involved in that.
Fantastic.
Just one more thing. What is important, though, is that nature is sort of underappreciated in cutting across economic and social spheres in other ways. So, for example, we recently published research about the importance of social capital, so the relationships, trust and values that we have in our communities, the importance of that to life chances of poorer children. And that has a massive intersection with green spaces. So we're doing a piece of work that we're launching next week called Connected Places. And one of the places in which people meet, poorer kids meet with richer kids, which is shown to boost their social mobility, is green spaces. But specifically, actually, green spaces can have a positive or negative effect. They can be a place where you go and play and do sport and meet other people from all different types of backgrounds, providing this rocket fuel to life chances. Or our research has shown that actually they can have a similar effect to an A road if designed badly. They can separate communities off. So we not only have to do the stuff that we know there's a strong evidence base for, but we have to start thinking about how you strategize for green spaces and how it cuts across a place's strategy in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, that the sort of cross section across different issues, whether that's growth, whether that's health, there's a bunch of different issues that this intersects with. So I think hopefully we'll explore those a bit more in a moment. Graham, can I come to you next, please?
You can, absolutely. Morning, everybody. Graham Duxbury, the Chief Executive of the charity Groundwork. On the question of why this all matters, I'll just start with a personal bit because I'm a big adherent to the concept of biophilia that you hear Dr. William Bird talk about a lot. This idea that as humans we're all kind of innately connected. We feel a pull towards the natural world and we want to be connected with it. And if we're disconnected from it, we feel a sense of anxiety and tension and so on and so forth. I can absolutely recognize that in myself. I feel that quite personally, but it's interesting for me to think about it and whether it applies at a wider social and community level as well. So I don't think we need to restate here the evidence about the benefit of that nature connection, but I want to add in why I think it matters to the places in which we operate as a charity. And I think in classic fashion I'll do 3 P's. One is I think there's a pride element to all of this. So however disadvantaged an area may be, however other people may term it as deprived and lacking, generally we find there are deep well springs of pride in those places, and the quality of the shared environment can either have a dispiriting or an energizing effect on how people perceive their neighborhood. So that sense of attachment, I think, is really fundamental when people think about their shared environment and their green spaces. Second P is something about practical action. So urban green space is a really brilliant setting for empowerment more generally. So people can do something. They can bring about a physical, visible change. They can contribute directly to something, and it can also help them to organise and tackle other issues in their community. So it's a brilliant kind of stepping stone to greater empowerment. And the last P for me is protection. So we know people mobilise really effectively and energetically to preserve green space. It's a really powerful force for good in society, and it should be seen as that, as opposed to the constant mantra about people blocking stuff. But we also know that green spaces are one of our best defences against climate impacts. So people are starting to think about protection in a slightly different way and thinking about how their green spaces, how green infrastructure can protect their communities from impacts of extreme weather and so on and so forth. So given that, why it all matters to us as an organisation in terms of our work is because it is, as people have said, it's a pressing social issue, a social justice issue, as well as an environmental one. And we know the benefits of being in nature are not equally available to everybody. That will be said a lot today. We also know that climate change impacts first and worst on those in society with least choice and least power and least protection, as Councillor Lux so eloquently pointed out in Nottingham. And we were actually set up 45 years ago now as an experiment in helping communities blighted by post-industrial dereliction to turn grey spaces green and to help people connect with nature on their doorstep. Now, the pressures may be different now. Development and demographic change are as challenging as disadvantage and industrial dereliction were in the 70s and 80s. But the need to preserve and improve and create new urban green spaces is just as great. And if there's one thing I'll say about the transformation, it's that size sometimes doesn't matter. So we've been involved in some really big kind of landscape scale stuff. Lots of Millennium Programme stuff where we converted old industrial premises into country parks like Penalta in South Wales and Rothwell Colliery in Leeds. But we've also been involved in some of the creating kind of really small pocket parks in the harshest urban environments. And I've seen alleyways in Manchester and bin yards in Beeston, turned into really vibrant community assets and community gardens. So that's the point I will make about transformation. That even the smallest bit of urban greening can make a massive difference to the way people perceive their neighbourhoods and the power it gives them to go on and think about what else they might improve in their local area.
Brilliant. Thank you, Graham. Last but not least, Paul.
Thanks very much for that. My name's Paul Lawrence. I'm the Chief Executive of the City of Edinburgh Council. You probably hear from my accent from the north of England, but I've worked in Scotland now for nearly 10 years. So I suppose trying to bring a north of the border perspective on some of the conversation today. I want to sort of just take a couple of minutes to both reflect on some of the achievements that and the journey that we've been through, but also some of the challenges. So three things really. First of all, for those taking part either as local authority elected members or as officers, the importance of political vision and political commitment. Many authorities around the UK have declared a climate emergency. Not all have declared a climate and nature emergency. And the importance for us of the declaration of the nature part of that was hugely important in terms of governance systems, processes, political decision making. So that stuff at a local level really, really matters to get that kind of top level endorsement, and that is been secured. We have 5 parties on the City of Edinburgh Council. That is a cross-party consensus approach. Secondly, boring word I know, but partnerships incredibly important. We were very, very lucky. I'm obliged to say, but I mean saying, to be part of the Future Parks Accelerator programme, working with partners right across the UK. And it led to what I would say was probably a disparate set of activities, forming a much more strategically integrated and impactful set of activities. And as an example, we now have our overall Edinburgh Thriving Green Spaces vision strategy and the approach to the Edinburgh Nature Network. It's the first one in Scotland. And then the Edinburgh Nature Network is now formally part of our statutory planning process and planning requirements. So the kind of strategic joining it all up, and on the back of that, it delivering the potential for putting the right resources in the right places internally. I'll come on to external in a minute. So on the back of that, we have a dedicated lead in our policy and strategy. I've dedicated additional ecologists in our parks and open spaces team. We have additional biodiversity functionality in our planning team. We have additional function in our resource in our outdoor learning team, to pick up the point I think that Tom was talking about before. So, it really has unlocked a kind of whole city approach and a different way of doing things. Two last points. One is We are incredibly lucky in Edinburgh, incredibly lucky to have rich social capital in the nature space. We have over 70 Friends of Parks groups. We, as many of you will know, who I hope have visited our magnificent city, have astonishing blue infrastructure, something like the Water of Leith and the Water of Leith Conservation Trust, who we work with. Working together with the community sector to ensure they can play their full role. Graham's organisation has been fantastic inspiration of that across the UK, has been hugely important. So understanding the kind of public, private, voluntary sector piece has been instrumental to everything we've achieved. And then lastly, the kind of scars on the back stuff. This isn't easy. And to the point that I think Lisa made around retrofitting our cities to be places where nature is, participating in nature is easier, or participating in physical activity and social activity is easier. Not easy. We have 2 World Heritage sites in Edinburgh. You'd be amazed at the amount of controversy at retrospecting World Heritage sites with green space when they weren't originally designed to be so in the 18th century. Scars on the back. Creating wider pavements with space for street trees and pocket parks, digging out space for other uses and implementing them, whether in the pandemic on a temporary basis or moving forward more permanently, scars on the back. So that depth of political commitment, that depth of partnership working, because this stuff, you know, it's wrong to say this stuff is easy. This is hard to create space in busy urban environments, many of which were built around the needs of the motor car well, not necessarily originally, but then certainly dramatically in the 50s to the 70s. Creating space for nature and keeping it and maintaining it is the challenge that we're all trying to rise to. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. There's so many, I mean, all of you have raised points and I would like to be able to cover all of those. But there's a strong theme between all of them, which is, so a lot of the conversation has been about the infrastructure that you've got and how you're working with that. And you've just talked about blue space and green space, some of it designated, some of it not. I'm kind of interested in the common theme around people and how, I mean, we've got 1,000 people on this call roughly, and it's people who ultimately will make the change. And I know the people that are on this call are already invested in this, but what I'm interested in from your various, you know, ranges of experience, how can you support others to make change? Because ultimately we can all individually do enough in our own organizations, but we will only scale the change if we get other people to engage in that. And I guess I'm really interested, because I know for a fact you all go about that in slightly different ways. And Paul, you've particularly focused around that social capital that you might have, and I'm going to come back to you, so prepare yourself on that. I'm really interested how you connect local groups, because ultimately they're the guardian. But Lisa, I'm going to come to you first, because you're sort of an enabling organisation that doesn't necessarily do the delivery yourself. You get other people to do it. Can you expand on that a bit more? So how do you support others to make change?
Yeah, I can. So we have an active environments framework. So creating an active environment, as we know, provides places and spaces for people to be more active and build healthier, active communities. So we've created this framework of specialist consultancy support for the sector, because we know bespoke procurement exercises are frequently conducted to appoint specialist support in either strategic planning, leisure procurement, urban design and planning. And these pieces of work are often quite similar in scale and scope, and they utilise our guidance. So this framework offers a strategic sport and leisure advice for the wider sector to utilise. So Active Design 3 is a toolkit which highlights activity for all as a foundational concept. It has 10 helpful principles to help support design in activity to create those healthier, resilient communities and considering the built and active environment. And just, I guess, some useful statistics. So for those who have a good quality active experience in the outdoors before the age of 11, only 5% lapse their connection during their lifestyle. And nature is integral to physical literacy, so children from deprived areas are less likely to visit the outdoors or engage in nature, and children's activity levels are dropping, particularly enjoy informal activity in nature. So I guess Contact with nature and natural environments is just shown to enhance mental health. It improves the experience of being outdoors, that we know, and being physically active. And I guess just maybe one or two examples of some work that we've helped support across the country. So the Burnley Outdoor Town Vision looks to celebrate and build upon the fantastic natural assets that Burnley have, making movement, physical activity and sport accessible to all residents. The key priorities include how do they grow and nurture collaboration, to influence integrated place and wellbeing policies at a strategic level, and to create those real bottom-up, community-led, neighbourhood-based green space initiatives, which then can bring forward inward investment and accessible opportunities. And a key foundation of that has been Burnley's Beat the Street initiative, hugely successful, not only just in encouraging people to be more active. I think it engaged over 12,000 people in physical activity, but it was a catalyst for a strong partnership working and new projects emerging, for example, local tree planting, the Big Burnley Walk and park yoga. I'll pause there. I've got lots of other examples, but I'll pause there because I'm conscious of time.
Fantastic, Lisa, thank you. David, I'm interested to come to you because clearly, I mean, private sector, yeah, so how do you actually physically go about engaging people in this? How are you enabling people to get involved?
Thanks, Hilary. Yeah, so yeah, private sector, but a particular sort of
Yes.
type of private sector organisation, I guess. But yeah, just actually picking up on the social capital point, I think there's something about different forms of social capital here. There's clear from what everyone has said so far that urban green spaces can be a massive focus for development of connection and social capital within communities. But I think that in terms of that enabling piece, there's something about the bridging social capital as well, and communities being able to connect with other communities, and particularly community led organizations being able to connect. So just in terms of the Nature Neighbourhoods project, one of the key findings from that has been the amazing sort of lessons that groups can take from each other when they come together as a cohort. So we've got 18 community sector partners spread across the country, and enabling them to learn from each other so they don't all have to sort of invent new versions of similar wheels has been one of the key things from that. But I guess we've been privileged as part of that program to be able to facilitate lots of face-to-face interaction between, you know, groups in Edinburgh, from Edinburgh to Plymouth. But we've also found when working with partners on other issues, actually, particularly access to food, that there's something about more localized learning and geographical clustering. So in our work with community partners on things like community fridges and local pantries, sorry to sort of take the focus from urban green spaces for a moment, we found that actually a really successful approach has been to, rather than identifying areas of the map where there's no activity at all, building out from existing sort of successful anchor organizations has been a really good way forward. And taking it back to Nature Neighbourhoods, there's a really established social enterprise in Manchester, So the City, who have been able to support a group of local people in another area of the city to set up their own community gardening group pretty much from scratch. So I think that is a really useful sort of approach. So yeah, enabling learning, so bridging as well as sort of bonding social capital.
Brilliant, thank you. Paul, I'm going to come back to you. I mean, I think what you've been doing in Edinburgh has been hugely inspirational, but I love the idea that it's, you know, it has to be across the board. It's all a systems change you're looking for here, and you've got it across all of the different elements of your of your local authority. But this question about how you're enabling others, because ultimately you again are trying to get other people to do this work, to take ownership, and the long-term care and maintenance of it for me is, I know that's a recurring thing that comes up from a lot of people I'm speaking to. You can create these spaces, but who's going to look after them? Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, probably two bits to that. I mean, on the latter piece, that there is no doubt that generally across the UK, we're not bad at creating new urban green spaces, but we are generally pretty, sorry to use a technical word, pretty crap at looking after them. And that's clearly because the resource for the maintenance isn't embedded in revenue budgets. Be interesting to see what happens in the spending review next week about this relationship between capital and revenue, as lots of capital, flies around the place, but budgets get squeezed. I mean, there's an inevitability about the consequences of that. We in Edinburgh, a bit of a plug, I suppose. We have now, or the Scottish Government have passed the legislation to enable local authorities to bring in visitor levies, tourist taxes, and we will be the first in the UK to do so for every bed night in the city. And there is no question but that the maintenance of public space, both green, blue and otherwise, will be a core priority for that. So additional funding streams where they come available, we know that's shall we say, a gap we need to plug. More generally, yeah, I mean, look, working in partnership is critical, but I think it's really important not to be complacent and kind of know where you are. So we are incredibly lucky to have so many nature-based community organisations. Interesting to hear from Lisa about Burnley. I always feel we are blessed in the number and the quality and the commitment of local organisations we have, but it partly goes to a question in the chat. Are the quality of either local authority owned or factored, as we say in Scotland, looked after, or community owned spaces is an area of deprivation? Are they in a less usable space than prosperous areas? Of course they are. Are flagship spaces in a better usable state than more informal spaces? Of course they are. Again, that point about the development of British housing policy and the implementation of it in the 50s, 60s and 70s, we were great at kind of creating green spaces in front of social housing, but most of it is pretty grim. And so we are engaged now in a substantial exercise to kind of try and reimagine that. The community growing piece that David talked about was very important, but to kind of know where you are and then to find a way of working with local community groups to kind of make spaces usable, useful and beautiful, can I say, to Graham's point. I think people take aspirational. We've got a hell of a long way to go, Hilary.
Yeah, completely. I mean, a lot of what you've just said really feeds into what you do day and daily, Graham, in terms of really, less about the flagship places, more about the local, hyper-local kind of engaging communities. I mean, what advice would you give, or what do you give to the local people that you work with in terms of leading the change that, inevitably we hear people in the local areas really wanting to affect change, but just not knowing how to do that, or how to get build the capacity to do it. So what advice do you do, and maybe what else do you practically do to handhold them through it?
Yeah. Well, as you say, I mean, our job really is to put professional skill sets at the disposal of local communities so that they can lead change for themselves. So it's the kind of expertise on tap as opposed to on top principle that we've always had. So we employ community workers and youth workers and landscape architects and education and employment specialists, and those are the people who exist to support others to make change in their local area. So that, the phrase capacity building is so important for us, not least because we can't always be everywhere all the time to devise and develop and manage projects. So helping people to organise and build skills and capability are really important so that they can deliver that change. I suppose, just to give a practical example of that, I think it's really exemplified by places that we're involved in that are starting to call themselves green community hubs. So these are kind of typical urban gardens, like we've got one in Kettering called the Green Patch. There's one in South Liverpool called Grow Speak, which are places that are bringing nature into the heart of communities, but they're also acting as a setting for a range of co-located service delivery, from health interventions to alternative education to advice on housing or energy bills. So enabling other service providers to make use of urban green space is a really important principle in all of this for me. And it was really typified when I was out in one of these spaces a week or two ago, speaking to a youth worker who was doing some work with a number of young people who just weren't engaging with schools. So that's, you know, the school were commissioning alternative education stuff. And he said whenever possible, he'd bring them down to the community garden, to the hub, to the green hub, to do something practical, because that's when they started opening up and started talking about their life and what was going on in their life. And anybody who's got teenagers will recognize that, you know, the best way to get a conversation going with a teenager is not to sit across the table from them and say what's going on. It's to just get involved in something practical and have that kind of side-to-side conversation. So it really worked, and we undervalue the potential of green space to be a setting for that kind of work. But the one bit of advice I give to anybody trying to do this is employ community workers. You know, seriously, if the answer to the challenges we're facing about resource constraints and inappropriate development is for people to organise and do more stuff for themselves, this doesn't happen by magic, especially in places where there are more transient populations or people are juggling multiple jobs to make ends meet, that kind of stuff. So good community work is vital to building consensus, negotiating conflict, identifying practical ways forward. But the big challenge is that that's a workforce that's been decimated over the last couple of decades. So if we're talking about, you know, unlocking new forms of finance, how to fund maintenance, but we're not focusing on how to resource community engagement and empowerment and community development functions, then we're really missing part of the answer.
Okay. Really helpful, all of that, and those were questions that I had in advance, and I'm looking both in the chat and the Q&A, and I've actually just spotted one there. And Tom, I'm coming to you. So this is from Eva. A lot of this seems to be human-centered rather than thinking about, oh, it's just disappeared, rather than nature that's as something that we're part of and connected to. If we begin with nature, I think there's greater scope for thinking about interaction rather than the constant creation of green spaces. And I think that's a really, really important point, because at the end of the day, the benefit that we're trying to deliver here is about how people connect and how they start to understand the need to care and want to do something about it themselves. And Tom, I know the RSA have been doing a lot of that, particularly with young people, and obviously introducing play as a mechanism to involve young people in the care of nature. Do you want to expand on that a bit more? As to, you know, what is that interplay between access and connection to nature versus the creation of green spaces, and why those two things are both important, but one isn't more important than the other?
Yeah, thanks, Lou. I mean, so a lot of this comes down to what is your design starting point for thinking about these green spaces in nature. So for us, for Play for Green Planet, the North Star guiding sort of principle for this is that we are trying to create a bond between young children and nature from the earliest of ages, because we believe, and the evidence suggests, that this has all sorts of benefits, not just for those children, but for nature as well. If they care about it from a young age, then they are going to be its stewards and its people speaking on behalf of it as they grow up. And this sort of the next stage to that then is, how do you build that bond between young children and nature? And that is about play, this outdoor classroom type approach, where you're not just asking children or allowing children to spend time in that place, but you are asking them how they might care and be stewards for these places, particularly. And I saw a question in the chat about in more deprived areas, right, where children just have less opportunity to build these connections with these types of spaces. And where that leads you is into thinking about how you design, where you place these green spaces and nurture nature in a different way. And you can sort of draw that thread through to things I think that both Paul and Graham have touched on in the social capital space, which is social capital and these relationships don't just form sort of willy-nilly. There are certain conditions around which communities are built. Our research suggests actually that relationships, particularly this bridging capital that David was talking about, across different types of people, that those bonds form when there is a common purpose to which people are working. So that might be the workplace, but that might be caring for a green space. And so those approaches, thinking differently about what these green spaces mean to us, what role they play, I think can have quite a big difference, make quite a big difference in how we think about designing these places and how we think about nurturing them and maintaining them.
Perfect, thank you. Now, there's a question here which I think, well, there's two actually that I'm drawn to, needless to say. Someone has asked a question about where does arts and heritage fit within this, and Tom, I'm not letting you off the hook there actually, because again, RSA are interested in the wider agenda, but Lisa, I want to bring you in here. So we're here to talk about nature in towns and cities, but clearly none of us live in just in bubbles, and the interplay between the historic environment, the quality of the natural environment, that thing that you talked about, Graham, in terms of pride of place, these things interplay with each other. So I wonder, does anybody want to comment on that? How does that interplay happen? Is it important? What can we do to encourage the sort of sense of place in the round is important, of which nature and access to nature is part of? Actually, maybe I'll start with you, Paul, because that clearly Edinburgh's, I mean, is so deeply steeped in, you know, a sense of heritage, a sense of history. How do those things interplay in your world?
Gosh, there's a PhD in that, I think. I used, before I became chief executive of the council, I was director of place here for 8.5 years. So it was the kind of, exactly that question was the kind of issue I dealt with on a daily basis. And the truth is that in some ways that plays out differently in different places depending on geography, history, demography, and so on. I would say, I mean, here in Edinburgh, there is a huge pride in place, but the public space is also contested. The use for commercial events as opposed for community activity, the use for different forms of transportation, as I talked about before. And we have a very strong debate, for example, about the relationship between the use of the city and its spaces and places by local people as opposed to visitors, of whom we have a very large amount. And the debates that have been going on in Europe, in Lisbon, in Venice, in Barcelona, in Amsterdam, around who is the city for, have played out in our city as well in the same way. As you would expect me to say, I'm trying to design inclusion into how the city is a kind of fundamental planning principle. So someone in the chat, I think, talking about spaces which work for people with chronic illnesses, neurodegenerative conditions, and so on, loud, busy spaces. How do you create spaces of quiet and calm in very busy urban areas? And of course, nature is fantastic for that. So managing all those conflicts, Hilary, is kind of the day job. I'm not honestly sure there's a simple answer beyond, kind of know what your assets really are, and for goodness sake, don't mess with them too much. But city development is an evolutionary process. I think all of us in jobs like mine are looking, for example, at what Paris has done over recent years, with a huge amount of interest, both in green and transport initiatives, and they seem to have gone with the grain of the place, despite it being very controversial. How do you keep evolving but sustain the grain of the place? And that's what we wrestle with on a daily basis, I think.
Yeah, that absolutely links into a sense of, it needs to feel authentic, doesn't it? Actually, it needs to feel and resonate to the people who live there and visit there as if it is of the place. You're not trying to constantly create new things. There's well, there are a number of questions in here. One in particular, Tommy, I'm going to come back to you, but also the whole question of access specifically to disadvantaged communities. So a couple of the comments here about, actually we know from our research that a lot of volunteering, a lot of community engagement actually are from people who are largely middle class, from less disadvantaged areas, and certainly from less diverse areas. Is there any evidence to suggest that anything in particular is working to draw in those communities more than others? If I go to you, Tom, first, and then I'll go to David.
Yeah, so I think what's important, I suppose, to start off from here is to differentiate a little bit about who, particularly in urban spaces, who is willing to sort of take on the mantle and lead the charge, but where the sort of more deprived areas are. So what we know actually in urban environments, very, very dense environments, is that these places are very close together. People actually do live quite closely together. So a deprived area or a deprived person may not come across their more middle class counterparts, not because they don't live close together, but because their daily lives and habits aren't necessarily interacting, and the routes they take, etc., the things that they do. So what we have found with Playful Green Planet is that there is a pent-up demand at the sort of local level to do something, to create more of these green spaces, to reclaim this unloved these unloved urban spaces, and there are lots of them. And so for us, the question is, how do we as the RSA empower these people, give them the tools to be able to do this work? And in part, that's a little bit about using our fellowship model to find others who are thinking similarly and forming these groups and giving them the sort of, and that doesn't, the first mover doesn't necessarily mean everybody has to be exactly the same demographic as that person, etc. People join. And the other part of this, and it's something I think Paul has spoken to a lot and very eloquently, is that this stuff is complex. Reclaiming an unloved urban space is not straightforward, particularly for children. Right, you have to find the land, you have to find the money, you have to put safeguarding procedures in place, develop a curriculum, etc. So we can help convene for those community activists and on their behalf, in order that there is a framework through which to go about this stuff, and they have somewhere to start. So a lot of it is just providing the platform for those with the energy. And the spaces in those deprived areas, so that we can find them actually, and they're not too far away.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. David, any particular advice around specifically disadvantaged or those that are most marginalised communities that you've had experience with?
Well, I guess just in terms of sort of some of the evidence from our funding programmes, I think there's something about definitions of volunteering and sort of formal involvement versus just accessing a space, and I guess there's also something around, do you have access to private green space in the form of a garden? And obviously the more affluent you are, the more likely you are to have access to that space. But in terms of some of the evidence from our funding programs, we've supported around 1,900 sort of nature-focused projects over the last 10 years. And they've told us that the people who access those spaces or benefit from those spaces and the projects that are running them most frequently are top three of people on low incomes, children and young people, and people with mental well-being challenges. So I think there's something here about what's volunteering and how are we capturing sort of formal volunteering involvement, and what is sort of lighter touch participation that can grow and develop into sort of a sense of localized ownership, especially when, to Tom's point, we're trying to actually rejuvenate some fairly unloved urban green spaces and encourage a local sense of ownership. So I think there's quite a spectrum of sort of what's formal volunteering through to just sort of accessing and repeat accessing and developing a sense of ownership and love
Ownership,
for a local green space.
And I think that is right, certainly in the trust. I mean, we have 50,000 volunteers, but what we definitely can see is a changing expectation about what volunteering means. From I'll do a day a week to I can give half an hour, or I can give an hour on this Tuesday, but maybe not for the next 2 weeks, that type of thing, and how we as organisations respond to that really constructively. Lisa, I'm going to come to you. So a couple of questions around who we're trying to reach, and actually we've heard a lot today actually about how we're trying to engage young people, particularly sort of under age 10, and also clearly working with community groups, which would suggest more sort of older adults. But there are obviously a wide range of people that we're trying to engage, and a couple of people said, well, what about teenagers in particular? But Sport England have done a massive amount of work across all age groups. So just curious about, do we have to think about different products for different age groups? Is there a different method by which you get to these different audiences? And I know you've done a huge amount of work around that. Do you want to expand?
Yeah, we'll do. So I think, what we found through our place work is that, it's back to Graham's point earlier, that there's a real sense of pride in these places. There really are, that people feel that they want to be there. So when, you talk about deprived areas, they don't see it as that. They see it as their home, it's their place and their space. And one of the things that we've found through the work is around, almost like the phrase, progress moves at the speed of trust. So when we work locally and we co-develop with those local communities, regardless of age, what we find is there is a greater buy-in. So actually one of the examples that we can give is in terms of, doing some work with some particular teenagers who didn't see their local park as for them. And they felt it was just, a space that they didn't want to go into, they didn't feel safe. And actually what we did is working with local trusted organisations in this place to really think about what they could do to feel that sense of ownership. And actually by doing that and by working with them within that local park and designing it with them, they felt that was for them. And actually the result of that was that they utilised that green space a lot more. They really felt that sense of connection to nature and to that green space, but they looked after it. So, back to Paul's point earlier about who looks after these spaces, all of a sudden then you've got an army of local people who care about that space, and then you see less vandalism, etc. So I think it's, for me, the principle around co-developing, co-working, working with teenagers and people of all ages to really understand what it is that they want from their space.
Okay, good, thank you. I've probably time for two more questions. Graham, there's a question that's high up on the Q&A. So it's that age-old debate about, does access get in the way of nature care, I guess? Does one have to damage the other? I'm personally very passionately of the view that you need people to connect with nature to get them to want to care for it. But there is an argument, of course, that some spaces do need space, do need tranquility, and it's probably less so in urban areas. But thoughts on that, because you've just mentioned, you've worked on some very large scale projects as well as very micro local, but that tension or notional tension between access and conservation, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, because I think that's right, and that is something that we need to accommodate in this conversation. So we've talked a lot, I guess, in this conversation about green space for its amenity value and its ability to deliver social outcomes for people, health and well-being and exercise and so on and so forth. But it's absolutely right that we also need nature for its own sake. It's a good in and of itself, and we all benefit from that kind of richness of our ecosystem. And there will always be spaces that need protecting, and we need to keep them pristine. We also shouldn't overlook the fact that some of those social benefits come from being able to get lost in a place that's quite wild and takes you away from people. So yes, green spaces are brilliant at providing a setting for people to come together and share and do stuff and collaborate, but sometimes you also just need to be on your own, and that's where you get the benefit. So there are all these different kind of push and pull factors, and that's why I think what we should be trying to do here is, at Paul's level, there's a strategy bit around this. There's green infrastructure strategies and making sure that that they do accommodate all of these different issues and needs and wants that we all have for that space. But that links, and I'll go back to my previous point here, with community level education and empowerment, so that people understand those choices and they understand why things are being managed in the way that they're being managed. Why we're not cutting the hedgerow down at a particular time of year? Well, because there's nesting birds in there. So it's all part of that constant process of educating people about what the benefit of all of this is. And as you say, we need more people to care about it. And my parting shot will be, if we want to ensure more people care about the green spaces, then we do need to engage a more diverse audience in this conversation. And we'll only do that if we ourselves are more diverse as a sector. And that's one of the challenges that we shouldn't overlook here.
I think that's right. I'm going to end with the killer question, because I know it's on the minds of just about everybody out there. So on one hand, a huge amount of enthusiasm for this work, just look how many people are engaged. And I've just come off another call where there's, again, a network of groups, organisations keen to do this. At the end of the day, though, we do know that funding for particularly public spaces has reduced dramatically, and public authorities are under more and more pressure, and the spending review is only likely to make that even harder. So the question is, does any of the panel have any suggestions around how revenue should or could be increased? Now maybe just make that this, because I'm going to come to all of you. It's not an easy subject, I know that, but I'm just curious, have you any experience or examples to show where you've been able to generate some of that very precious revenue support for this kind of work, or suggestions how it could be done better? Paul, I'm going to start with you, because I know this is top of your mind.
Well, I kind of think I've already answered it at one level, which is, as I say, we're very excited about the visitor levy that will come into place in Edinburgh next summer. And we're busy now both on the mechanics of collection, which is by no means straightforward, but also on priorities for investment and expenditure. And for me, it's a bit like the early days of the lottery, for those of you with long enough memories, which was, hang on a minute, there's going to be a source of cash coming. Okay, it's got some general parameters, but what makes greatest impact? So it's really exciting here, and we're just kind of embarking on that. So, but I appreciate that's not open to everyone. My only other counter is that yes, of course, maintenance is important, and there is a huge battle, particularly within the local authorities, to try and deal with day-to-day expenditure, whether we're on spaces, places, or buildings, or people. That's not going to go away, I don't think. But there's a hell of a lot of this stuff that can be done, and the amount of money is relatively small. If you've got a local authority which is permissive in its approach, yes, we want people to do stuff. That doesn't cost anything. Hugely important. And actually, that message is I'm not having a go at my colleagues, but that message is not universally the case. Then, yeah, we want to do stuff, and we need a bit of a helping hand with whatever it might be. That's not expensive either. So the amount of money involved in the most grassroots work is marginal. I do not believe that is impossible to deliver. Now, developing a huge new green space and maintaining it for 25 years is not straightforward. I don't think that's what we're primarily talking about. We're talking about engaging the community to take ownership of spaces to make them better for everyone. And I don't think finding those resources.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, small amounts of money can make a disproportionately huge impact in this particular arena. I'm going to ask you to I'm out of time. Do I have to stop people? Anyway, I'm going to keep going until somebody kicks me out. Graham, very quickly, your thoughts on this in terms of attracting essentially revenue.
Don't forget the money that's already in the system. The government has got £1 billion neighbourhoods plan that it's putting through local authorities. There's a community wealth fund that's about to get launched. There's a lot of stuff that, if we can make the case that green infrastructure, green spaces can deliver the outcomes that those funds are intended for, then some of that money can find its way into this conversation.
I think that's right. I think there's also a levering of some of that money, because there are different sources of money, but they need to lever each other to make greater impact. Lisa, any final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, just, I mean, there's a reason why we've deliberately focused not just our revenue funding, but our capital funding through this place as well. And we see those local green spaces, and okay, you know, accepting that that's not every place in the country. We're investing in 100 places across the country, but I would encourage people within those priority places to contact their active partnership to talk about how you can bring those funds in. And I guess the final point from me, we've seen some really good examples about using crowdfunding, where people have managed to, you know, generate a really positive crowdfunding campaign, which again, not just bringing in and leaving the money, but it creates those other skills, it creates that sense of ownership and that sense of pride, and actually gets people to feel part of it. So that would be the other thing that I would encourage.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid I'm out of time. I would have come to the other two, but I've been going to be kicked out of my space. Thank you so much to my fantastic panel and for the questions that everyone has sent in. I did my best to get around most of them. Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you all. That was brilliant. I mean, what